The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 3, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 7, Side 1. The cost of books and the dearth of funds for schools produced a degree of illiteracy which would have seemed shameful to ancient Greece or Rome. North of the Alps, before 1100, literacy was almost confined to clerics, clergymen, accountants, scribes, governmental officials, and professional men. In the 12th century, the business classes must have been literate, for they kept elaborate accounts. In a household, a book was a precious thing. Usually it was read aloud to several listeners. Many later rules of punctuation and style were determined by convenience for oral reading. Books were carefully exchanged from family to family, monastery to monastery, country to country. Libraries, though small, were numerous. St. Benedict had ruled that every Benedictine monastery should have a library. Carthusian and Cistercian houses, despite St. Bernard's aversion to learning, became sedulous collectors of books. Many cathedrals, Toledo, Barcelona, Bamberg, Hildesheim, had substantial libraries. Canterbury had 5,000 books in 1300. But this was exceptional. Most libraries had less than 100. Cluny, one of the best, had 570 volumes. Manfred, king of the Sicilies, had a valuable collection, which passed to the papacy and became the nucleus of the Greek collections in the Vatican. The papal library began with Pope Damasus, from 366 to 384. Its precious manuscripts and archives were mostly lost in the turmoil of the 13th century. The present Vatican Library dates from the 15th century. The universities, or rather their college halls, began to have libraries in the 12th century. St. Louis founded the Library of Sainte-Chapelle in Paris and enriched it with books copied for him from 100 monasteries. Many libraries, like those of Notre Dame, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and the Sorbonne, were open to responsible students, and volumes might be taken out on adequate security. The student of today can hardly appreciate the literary wealth that city and college libraries lay freely at his feet. There were here and there private libraries. Even in the darkness of the 10th century we find Gerbert collecting books with true bibliophile passion. Some other churchmen, like John of Salisbury, had their own collections, and a few nobles had small libraries in their chateaux. Frederick Barbarossa and Frederick II had considerable collections. Henry of Aragon, Lord of Vienna in Spain, gathered a great library, which was publicly burned on the charge that he had intercourse with the devil. About 1200, Daniel of Morley brought to England from Spain a precious multitude of books. In the 12th century, Europe discovered the wealth of Spain in books. Scholars descended upon Toledo, Cordova, and Seville, and a flood of new learning poured up over the Pyrenees to revolutionize the intellectual life of the adolescent North. 3. Translators. Medieval Europe, partly united by a common language, was still divided into Latin and Greek halves, mutually hostile and ignorant. The Latin heritage, except of law, was forgotten in the Greek East. The Greek heritage, except in the Sicilies, was forgotten in the West. Part of the Greek heritage was hidden beyond the walls of Christendom, in Moslem Jerusalem, Alexandria, Cairo, Tunis, Sicily, and Spain. As for the vast and distant world of India, China, and Japan, long rich in literature, philosophy, and art, Christians, before the 13th century, knew almost nothing. Some of the work of linking the diverse cultures was performed by the Jews, who moved among them like fertilizing subterranean streams. As more and more Jews migrated from Moslem realms into Christendom and lost knowledge of Arabic, their scholars found it desirable to translate Arabic works, many written by Jews, into the only language generally understood by the savants of the scattered race, Hebrew. So Joseph Kimchi, circa 1105 to circa 1170, at Narbonne, translated the Jewish philosopher Bayez's Guide to the Duties of the Heart. Joseph was the father of brilliant sons, but even more important as translators were the progeny of Judah ben Saul ibn Tibbon, circa 1120 to circa 1190. He, too, like Kimchi, had moved from Moslem Spain to southern France. And though he was one of the most successful physicians of his time, he found energy to translate into Hebrew the Judeo-Arabic works of Saadia Gaon, Ibn Gabirol, and Jehuda Halavi. His son Samuel, circa 1150 to circa 1232, stirred the Jewish world by translating into Hebrew Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed. Samuel's son Moses ibn Tibbon translated from the Arabic Euclid's Elements, Avicenna's Smaller Canon, Al-Razi's Antidotary, 3 works of Maimonides, and Averroes's shorter commentaries on Aristotle. Samuel's grandson, Jacob ibn Tibbon, besides leading the fight for Maimonides in Montpellier and earning fame as an astronomer, translated several Arabic treatises into Hebrew and some into Latin. Samuel's daughter married a still more famous scholar, Jacob Anatoli. Born in Marseille about 1194, Jacob was invited by Frederick II to teach Hebrew at the University of Naples. There he translated into Hebrew the larger commentaries of Averroes, profoundly affecting Jewish philosophy. A like stimulus was given to Hebrew medicine through the translation of Al-Razi's Kitab al-Mansuri by the physician and philosopher Shem Tov at Marseille in 1264. Many Hebrew translations from the Arabic were rendered into Latin, so a Hebrew version of Avenzoar's Taisir, or Aid to the Health, was turned into Latin at Padua in 1280. Early in the 13th century, a Jew translated the entire Old Testament directly and literally into Latin. The devious routes of cultural migration are exemplified by the Fables of Bidpai, which were translated into English from a Spanish translation of a Latin translation of a Hebrew translation of an Arabic translation of a Pahlavi translation of the supposedly original Sanskrit. The main stream whereby the riches of Islamic thought were poured into the Christian West was by translation from Arabic into Latin. About 1060, Constantine the African translated into Latin Al-Razi's Liber Experimentorum, the Arabic medical works of Isaac Judaeus, and Hunayn's Arabic version of Hippocrates' Aphorisms and Galen's Commentary. At Toledo, soon after its conquest from the Moors, the enlightened and tolerant Archbishop Raymond, circa 1130, organized a corps of translators under Domenico Gundisalvi, and commissioned them to translate Arabic works of science and philosophy. Most of the translators were Jews who knew Arabic, Hebrew, and Spanish, sometimes also Latin. The busiest member of the group was a converted Jew, John of Spain, or of Seville, whose Arabic patronymic, Ibn Daud, son of David, was remodeled by the schoolmen into Avendiath. John translated a veritable library of Arabic and Jewish works by Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, Al-Farabi, and Al-Khwarizmi. Through this last work he introduced the Hindu-Arabic numerals to the West. Almost as influential was his rendering of a pseudo-Aristotelian book of philosophy and occultism, the Secretum Secretorum, whose wide circulation is indicated by the survival of 200 manuscripts. Some of these translations were made directly from Arabic into Latin, some were made into Castilian and then translated into Latin by Gundisalvi. In this way, the two scholars transformed Ibn Gabirol's Mekor Hayim into that Fons Vitae, or Fountain of Life, which made Avicebron into one of the most famous philosophers in the scholastic ken. Minor tributaries fed the Arabic-Latin current. Adelard of Bath, having learned Arabic in Antioch, Tarsus, and Toledo, made from an Arabic version the first Latin rendering of Euclid in 1120, and introduced Moslem trigonometry to the West by translating the astronomical tables of Al-Khwarizmi in 1126. In 1141, Peter the Venerable, abbot of Cluny, with the aid of 3 Christian scholars and an Arab, turned the Koran into Latin. Moslem alchemy and chemistry entered the Latin world through a translation of an Arabic text by Robert of Chester in 1144. A year later, an Italian, Plato of Tivoli, translated the epical treatise Hibur HaMashiach of the Jewish mathematician Abraham Bar Hia. The greatest of the translators was Gerard of Cremona. Arriving in Toledo about 1165, he was impressed by the wealth of Arabic literature in science and philosophy. He resolved to translate the best of it into Latin, and spent the remaining 9 years of his life in the task. He learned Arabic, and apparently had the help of a native Christian and a Jew. It seems incredible that he should have made his 71 translations unaided. To him, the West owed Latin versions of Aristotle's Posterior Analytics, on the heavens and the earth, on generation and corruption, and meteorology, several commentaries by Alexander of Aphrodisias, Euclid's Elements and Data, Archimedes' On the Measurement of the Circle, Apollonius of Perga's Conics, 11 works ascribed to Galen, several works of Greek astronomy, 4 volumes of Greco-Arabic physics, 11 books of Arabic medicine, including the largest works of Al-Razi and Avicenna, Al-Farabi on the syllogism, 3 works by Al-Kindi, and 2 by Isaac Israeli, 14 works of Arabic mathematics and astronomy, 3 sets of astronomical tables, and 7 Arabic works on geomancy and astrology. No other man in history has ever done so much to enrich one culture with another. We can only compare Gerard's industry with that of Hunayn ibn Ishaq and Al-Mamun's House of Wisdom, which in the 9th century had poured Greek science and philosophy into an Arabic mold. Next to Spain as donor in this transfusion of culture was the Norman kingdom of the Sicilies. Soon after their conquest of the island in 1091, the Norman rulers employed translators to turn into Latin the Arabic or Greek works on mathematics and astronomy then current in Palermo. Frederick II at Foggia carried on the work, and partly for that purpose brought to his court one of the strangest and most active minds of the early 13th century. Michael Scott derived his cognomen from his native Scotland. We find him at Toledo in 1217, in Bologna in 1220, in Rome in 1224 to 1227, thereafter at Foggia or Naples. His first important translation was Albitrugi's Spherix, a critique of Ptolemy. Fascinated by discovering the scope and freedom of Aristotle's thought, Scott translated into Latin from Arabic versions the history of animals, including On the Parts of Animals and On the Generation of Animals, and an unverified tradition ascribed to him translations of the metaphysics, the physics, on the soul, on the heavens, perhaps also the ethics. Michael's versions of Aristotle reached Albertus Magnus and Roger Bacon and stirred the development of science in the 13th century. Charles of Anjou continued the royal patronage of translators in southern Italy. The Jewish savant Moses of Salerno worked for him, and it was probably Charles who financed the Latin translation in 1274 of Al-Razi's medical leviathan, the Liber Continens, by the Jewish scholar Faraj ben Salim of Girgenti. All the Latin translations so far mentioned of Greek science and philosophy were made from Arabic versions, sometimes from Arabic versions of Syriac versions, of the already obscure originals. They were not as inaccurate as Roger Bacon charged, but there was clearly need of more direct renderings. Among the earliest such versions were those made of Aristotle's Topics, Elenchi, and Posterior Analytics by James, known to us only as a clerk of Venice, at some time before 1128. In 1154, Eugene the Emir of Palermo translated the Optics of Ptolemy, and in 1160 he shared in a Latin translation of the Almagest, directly from the Greek. Meanwhile, Aristippus of Catania had translated, circa 1156, the Lives of the Philosophers by Diogenes Laertius, and the Meno and Phaedo of Plato. The capture of Constantinople by the Crusaders had less result in translations than might have been expected. We hear only of a partial version of Aristotle's Metaphysics from 1209. A fallow interval ensued. Then, about 1260, William of Morbeke, Flemish Archbishop of Corinth, began, probably with aids, a series of direct translations from the Greek whose number and importance rank him only next to Gerard of Cremona among the heroes of cultural transmission. It was partly at the request of his friend and fellow Dominican Thomas Aquinas that he translated so many of Aristotle's works. The History of Animals, On the Generation of Animals, Politics, and Rhetoric, and completed or revised earlier direct versions of the Metaphysics, the Meteorology, and On the Soul. For St. Thomas, he translated several Greek commentaries on Aristotle or Plato. For good measure, he added versions of Hippocrates' Prognostics, Galen on Foods, and divers works in physics by Hero of Alexandria and Archimedes. Perhaps we owe to him also a translation, formerly ascribed to Robert Grosseteste, of Aristotle's Ethics. These translations provided part of the material from which St. Thomas built his magisterial Summa Theologica. By 1280, Aristotle had been almost completely transmitted to the Western mind. The effects of all these translations upon Latin Europe were revolutionary. The influx of texts from Islam and Greece profoundly stirred the reawakening world of scholarship, compelled new developments in grammar and philology, enlarged the curriculum of the schools, and shared in the astonishing growth of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries. It was merely an incident that, through the inability of the translators to find Latin equivalents, many Arabic words were now introduced into the languages of Europe. It was more important that algebra, the zero, and the decimal system entered the Christian West through these versions, that the theory and practice of medicine were powerfully advanced by the translation of the Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Jewish masters, and that the importation of Greek and Arabic astronomy compelled an expansion of theology and a reconception of deity, prefacing the greater change that would follow Copernicus. The frequent references of Roger Bacon to Averroes, Avicenna, and Alpharabius give one measure of the new influence and stimulation. Philosophy, said Bacon, has come down to us from the Arabs. And we shall see that Thomas Aquinas was led to write his Summas to halt the threatened liquidation of Christian theology by Arabic interpretations of Aristotle. Islam had now repaid to Europe the learning that it had borrowed through Syria from Greece, and as that learning had aroused the great age of Arabic science and philosophy, so now would it excite the European mind to inquiry and speculation, would force it to build the intellectual cathedral of scholastic philosophy, and would crack stone after stone of that majestic edifice to bring the collapse of the medieval system in the 14th century and the beginnings of modern philosophy in the ardor of the Renaissance. 4. The schools. The transmission of culture from generation to generation was undertaken by the family, the church, and the school. Moral education was stressed in the Middle Ages at the expense of intellectual enlightenment, as intellectual education is today stressed at the expense of moral discipline. In England it was not unusual in the middle and upper classes to send a boy of 7 or so to be brought up for a time in another home, partly to cement family friendships, partly to offset the laxity of parental love. The splendid school system of the Roman Empire had decayed in the tumult of invasion and the depopulation of the towns. When the tidal wave of migration subsided in the 6th century, a few lay schools survived in Italy. The rest were mostly schools for training converts and prospective priests. For some time, from 500 to 800, the Church gave all her attention to moral training and did not reckon the transmission of secular knowledge as one of her functions. But under the prodding of Charlemagne, cathedrals, monasteries, parish churches, and convents opened schools for the general education of boys and girls. At first the monastic schools bore nearly all this burden. A schola interior provided instruction for novices or oblates, and a schola exterior offered education to boys, apparently without charge. In Germany, these monastic schools survived the disorders of the 9th century and shared productively in the Ottonian Renaissance. In the 9th and 10th centuries, Germany led France in the graces of the mind. In France, the disintegration of the Carolingian house and the raids of the Northmen struck cruel blows at the monastic schools. The palace school that Charlemagne had established at the Frank court did not long outlive Charles the Bald, who died in 877. The French episcopacy grew stronger as the kings grew weaker. When the North raids subsided, the bishops and secular clergy were richer than the abbots and the monasteries. And while the monastic schools declined in the 10th century, cathedral schools rose at Paris, Chartres, Orléans, Tours, Laon, Reims, Liège, and Cologne. When the good and great Fulbert died at Chartres, Bishop Ivo, possibly from 1040 to 1116, maintained the standards and renown of its cathedral school in classical studies, and this fine tradition was carried on by Ivo's successor, Bernard of Chartres, whom John of Salisbury in the 12th century described as, in modern times, the most astounding spring of letters in Gaul. In England, the Cathedral School of York was famous even before it gave Alcuin to Charlemagne. The School of Canterbury became almost a university, with an abundant library, and no less a man as secretary than the aforesaid John of Salisbury, one of the sanest scholars and philosophers of the Middle Ages. In such schools, those students who were preparing for the priesthood were apparently supported by cathedral funds, while others paid a modest fee. The Third Lateran Council of 1179 decreed that, in order that the opportunity of reading and making progress may not be taken away from poor children, let some sufficient benefice be assigned in every cathedral church for a master who shall teach gratis, the clerks of the same church and poor scholars. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 required the establishment of a chair of grammar in every cathedral of the Christian world, and instructed each archbishop to maintain also chairs of philosophy and canon law. The decretals of Pope Gregory IX, from 1227 to 1241, directed every parish church to organize a school of elementary instruction, and recent researches indicate that such parochial schools, chiefly devoted to religious instruction, were common throughout Christendom. What proportion of the adolescent population went to school? Of girls, apparently only the well-to-do. Most convents maintained schools for girls, like that which at Argenteuil gave such excellent classical training to Héloïse, circa 1110. But these schools probably reached only a modest percentage of girls. Some cathedral schools admitted girls. Abelard speaks of the women of noble birth who attended his school at Notre Dame in Paris in 1114. Boys had a better chance, but it was presumably difficult for the son of a serf to get an education. However, we hear of serfs who managed to get sons into Oxford. Much that is now taught in schools was then learned at home or through apprenticeship in shops. Certainly the spread and excellence of medieval art suggest wide opportunities for training in arts and crafts. One calculation reckons the number of boys in elementary schools in England in 1530 at 26,000, in an estimated population of 5 million, about 1/30th of the proportion in 1931. But a recent study concludes that the 13th century made a closer approach to popular and social education than the 16th. Normally, the cathedral school was directed by a canon of the cathedral chapter, variously called archiscola, scholarius, or scholasticus. The teachers were clerks in minor orders. All instruction was in Latin. Discipline was severe. Flogging was considered as necessary in education as hell in religion. Winchester School greeted its students with a frank hexameter. Aut discede. Manet sors tertia caedi. Learn or depart. A third alternative is to be flogged. The curriculum began with the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, logic, and passed on to the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. These were the 7 liberal arts. These terms did not then bear quite their modern meaning. Trivium, of course, meant 3 ways. Liberal arts were those that Aristotle had defined as the proper subjects for freemen who sought not practical skills, which were left to apprentices, but intellectual and moral excellence. Varro, from 116 to 127 B.C., had written 9 books of disciplines, listing 9 studies as constituting the Greco-Roman curriculum. Marcianus Capella, a North African scholar of the 5th century A.D., in a widely used pedagogical allegory on the marriage of philology and Mercury, had barred medicine and architecture as too practical, and the famous 7 remained. Grammar was not the dull study that loses the soul of a language in studying its bones. It was the art of writing, grapho or gramma. Cassiodorus defined it as such study of great poetry and oratory as would enable one to write with correctness and elegance. In medieval schools it began with the Psalms, passed to other books of the Bible, then to the Latin Fathers, then to the Latin classics, Cicero, Virgil, Horace, Statius, Ovid. Rhetoric continued to mean the art of speaking, but again included considerable study of literature. Logic seems a rather advanced subject for the trivium, but perhaps it was good that students should learn to reason as early as they loved to argue. The economic revolution brought some changes in the educational scene. Cities that lived by commerce and industry felt a need for employees with practical training, and against much ecclesiastical opposition, they established secular schools in which lay teachers gave instruction in return for fees paid by the parents of the pupils. In 1300, the fee for a year in a private grammar school in Oxford was 4 or 5 pence, or $4.50. Villani in 1283 reckoned 9,000 boys and girls in the church schools of Florence, 1,100 in 6 abacus schools that prepared them for a business career, and 575 pupils in secondary schools. Secular schools appeared in Flanders in the 12th century. By the second half of the 13th, the movement had spread to Lübeck and the Baltic cities. In 1292 we hear of a schoolmistress keeping a private school in Paris. Soon she was one of many. The secularization of education was on its way. 5. Universities of the South. Secular schools were especially numerous in Italy. Teachers there were usually laymen, not clerics as beyond the Alps. In general, the spirit and culture of Italy were less ecclesiastical than elsewhere. Indeed, about the year 970, one Vilgardus organized at Ravenna a movement for the restoration of paganism. There were, of course, many cathedral schools. Those of Milan, Pavia, Aosta, and Parma were particularly competent, as we may judge from such graduates as Lanfranc and Anselm. And Monte Cassino under Desiderius was almost a university. The survival of municipal institutions, the successful resistance of the Lombard cities to Barbarossa in 1176, and the rising demand for legal and commercial knowledge worked together to give Italy the honor of establishing the first medieval university. In 1925, the University of Pavia celebrated the 1100th anniversary of its foundation by Lothair I. Probably this was a school of law rather than a university. It was not until 1361 that it received its charter as a studium generale, the medieval name for a university uniting diverse faculties. It was one of many schools that from the 9th century onward revived the study of Roman law. Rome, Ravenna, and Orléans in the 9th century, Milan, Narbonne, and Lyon in the 10th, Verona, Mantua, and Angers in the 11th. Bologna was apparently the first of the West European cities to enlarge its school into a studium generale. In 1076, says the chronicler Odofridus, a certain Master Peppo began by his own authority to lecture on the laws at Bologna, and he was a man of the greatest renown. Other teachers joined him, and by the time of Irnerius, the Bologna School of Law was by common consent the best in Europe. Irnerius began to teach law at Bologna in 1088. Whether his studies of Roman law convinced him of the historical and practical arguments for the supremacy of the imperial over the ecclesiastical power, or whether the rewards of imperial service attracted him, he turned from the Guelph to the Ghibelline side and interpreted the revived jurisprudence to favor imperial claims. Appreciative emperors contributed funds to the school, and a swarm of German students came down to Bologna. Irnerius composed a volume of glosses or comments on the Corpus Juris of Justinian, and applied scientific method to the organization of law. The Summa Codicis Irnerii, compiled by him or from his lectures, is a masterpiece of exposition and argument. With Irnerius began the golden age of medieval jurisprudence. Men from every country in Latin Europe came to Bologna to learn the rejuvenated science of the law. Irnerius's pupil Gratian applied the new methods to ecclesiastical legislation and published the first code of canon law in 1139. After Irnerius, the four doctors, Bulgarus, Martinus, Jacobus, and Hugo, in a series of famous glosses, applied the Justinian Code to the legal problems of the 12th century and secured the adoption of Roman law in an ever-widening sphere. Early in the 13th century, the elder Accursius, possibly from 1185 to 1260, the greatest of the glossators, summed up their work and his own in a glossa ordinaria, which became the standard authority by which kings and communes broke the sway of feudal law and fought the power of the popes. The papacy did what it could to halt this exhumation of a code that made religion a function and servant of the state. But the new study fed and expressed the bold rationalism and secularization of the 12th and 13th centuries, and raised a proliferating class of lawyers who labored to reduce the role of the Church in government and to extend the authority of the state. St. Bernard complained that the courts of Europe rang with the laws of Justinian and no longer heard the laws of God. The spread of the new jurisprudence was as strong a stimulus as the Arabic and Greek translations in generating that respect and passion for reason which was to beget and bedevil scholasticism. We do not know when a school of arts, that is, the 7 liberal arts, arose in Bologna, nor when was founded its celebrated school of medicine. So far as we know, the only connection among the 3 schools was in the fact that the graduates of any of them received their degrees from the Archdeacon of Bologna. The professors organized themselves into a collegium or guild. About 1215, the students, in whatever faculty, associated themselves into 2 groups, a Universitas Citromontanorum, or union of students from south of the Alps, and a Universitas Ultramontanorum, or union of students from beyond the Alps. From the beginning of the 13th century there were women students in these universities, and in the 14th century there were women professors on the Bologna faculties. The student guilds, originated to provide mutual protection and self-government, came in the 13th century to exercise extraordinary power over the teaching staffs. By organized boycotts of unsatisfactory teachers, the students could end the pedagogical career of any man at Bologna. In many cases, the salaries of the professors were paid by the student universities, and the professors were compelled to swear obedience to the rectors of the universities, that is, to the head officers of the student guilds. A teacher desiring leave of absence, even for a day, was obliged to obtain permission from his pupils through their rectors, and he was expressly forbidden to create holidays at his pleasure. Regulations established by the student guilds determined at what minute the teacher should begin his lecture, when he should end it, and what penalties he should pay for deviations from these rules. If he overtalked his hour, the students were instructed by the guild statutes to leave. Other guild regulations fined a teacher for skipping a chapter or decretal in his exposition of the laws, and determined how much of the course was to be given to each part of the texts. At the outset of each academic year, the professor was required to deposit £10 with the Bologna Bank. From this sum, the fines laid upon him by the rectors were deducted, and the remainder was refunded to him at the close of the year on instruction from the rectors. Committees of students were appointed to observe the conduct of each teacher and report irregularities or deficiencies to the rectors. If these arrangements seem to the modern student unusually sensible, it should be remembered that the law students at Bologna were men between 17 and 40 years of age, old enough to provide their own discipline, that they came to study, not to play, that the professor was not the employee of trustees, but a freelance lecturer whom the students in effect engaged to instruct them. The teacher's salary at Bologna consisted of fees paid him by his students and fixed by agreement with them. This system of payment was changed toward the end of the 13th century when Italian cities, eager to have universities of their own, offered municipal salaries to certain Bolognese professors. The city of Bologna thereupon, in 1289, promised to pay 2 professors an annual stipend, but the choice of professors was still left to the students. Gradually, the number of these municipal salaria increased, and in the 14th century the selection of professors passed with their payment to the city. When Bologna became part of the Papal States in 1506, the appointment of the teachers became a function of the ecclesiastical authorities. In the 13th century, however, the University of Bologna, and in less degree the other universities of Italy, were marked by a lay spirit, almost an anti-clericalism, hardly to be found in other centers of European education. Whereas in these others the chief faculty was theology, there was at Bologna no theological faculty at all before 1364. Theology there was replaced by canon law. Even rhetoric took the form of law, and the art of writing became, at Bologna, Paris, Orléans, Montpellier, Tours, the ars dictaminis, or ars notaria, the art of writing legal, business, or official documents, and special degrees were given in this art. It was a common saying that the most realistic education obtainable was to be had in Bologna. A favorite story told how a Parisian pedagogue unlearned at Bologna what he had taught at Paris, and then came back to Paris and untaught it. In the 12th century, Bologna led the movement of the European mind. In the 13th, it allowed its teaching to stiffen into a stagnant scholasticism of law. The Accursian gloss became a sacred and almost unchangeable text, impeding the progressive adaptation of law to the flux of life. The spirit of inquiry fled to freer fields. Italy broke out into universities in the 12th and 13th centuries. Some of them were spawned by Bologna through the emigration of professors or students. So in 1182, Pilius left to set up a school in Modena. In 1188, Jacobus de Mandra went to Reggio Emilia and brought his pupils with him. In 1204, another migration, probably from Bologna, established a studium generale, or union of several faculties, at Vicenza. In 1215, Rofridus left the University of Bologna to open a law school at Arezzo. In 1222, a large succession of students and teachers from Bologna expanded an old school at Padua. Faculties of medicine and the arts were added to the School of Law at Padua. Venice sent her students there and contributed to the professorial salaries paid by the city. And in the 14th century, Padua became one of the most vigorous centers of European thought. In 1224, Frederick II founded the University of Naples to keep the students of South Italy from flocking north. Perhaps for like reasons, as well as to train men for ecclesiastical diplomacy, Innocent IV established the University of the Court of Rome in 1244, which followed the papal court in its migration even to Avignon. In 1303, Boniface VIII founded the University of Rome, which rose to glory under Nicholas V and Leo X, and won the name of Sapienza under Paul III. Siena inaugurated its municipal university in 1246, Piacenza in 1248. By the end of the 13th century, schools of law and the arts, and sometimes schools of medicine too, were to be found in every major city of Italy. The universities of Spain were unique in being founded and chartered by the kings, serving them and submitting to governmental control. Castile developed a royal university at Palencia in 1208, later at Valladolid in 1304. Leon had one at Salamanca in 1227, the Baleares at Palma in 1280, Catalonia at Lerida in 1300. Despite this royal connection, the Spanish universities accepted ecclesiastical supervision and funds, and some, like Palencia, grew out of cathedral schools. The University of Salamanca was richly endowed in the 13th century by San Fernando and Alfonso the Wise, and soon stood on an equal footing of fame and learning with Bologna and Paris. Many of these institutions gave instruction in Latin, mathematics, astronomy, theology, and law, some in medicine, Hebrew, or Greek. A school of Oriental studies was opened at Toledo in 1250 by Dominican monks to teach Arabic and Hebrew. Good work must have been done there, for one of its graduates, Raymond Martin, circa 1260, showed familiarity with all major philosophers and theologians of Islam. Arabic studies were prominent also at the University of Seville, founded by Alfonso the Wise in 1254. At Lisbon in 1290, the poet King Denis gave a university to Portugal. 6. Universities of France. The unquestioned leader of the European mind in the medieval meridian of the 12th and 13th centuries was France. Its cathedral schools had from the early 11th century achieved international renown. If these schools flowered into a great university at Paris rather than at Chartres, Laon, or Reims, it was probably because the thriving commerce of the Seine and the business of a capital had brought to the city the wealth that lures the intellect and finances science, philosophy, and art. The first known master of the Cathedral School of Notre Dame was William of Champeaux, possibly from 1270 to 1121. It was his lectures, given in the cloisters of Notre Dame, that stirred up the intellectual movement out of which the University of Paris grew. When, circa 1103, Abélard came out of Brittany, slew William with a syllogism, and began the most famous lectures in French history, students flocked to hear him. The schools of Paris swelled their ranks and masters multiplied. A master, or magister, in the educational world of 12th century Paris was a man licensed to teach by the chancellor of the Cathedral of Notre Dame. The University of Paris rose by now untraceable steps from the church schools of the city, and derived its first unity from this single source of pedagogical licensing. Normally, the license was given gratis to anyone who had been for an adequate period the pupil of an authorized master, and whose application was approved by that master. It was one of the charges made against Abélard that he had set himself up as a teacher without having served such an approved apprenticeship. This conception of the teaching art in terms of master and apprentice shared in the idea and origin of the university. As the masters multiplied, they naturally formed a guild. The word universitas had for centuries been applied to any collectivity, including guilds. In 1214, Matthew Paris described a fellowship of the elect masters at Paris as an institution of long standing. We may assume, but cannot prove, that the university took form toward 1170, rather as a guild of teachers than as a union of faculties. About 1210, a bull of Innocent III, himself a graduate of Paris, recognized and approved the written statutes of this teachers' guild, and another bull of the same pope empowered the guild to choose a proctor to represent it at the papal court. By the middle of the 13th century, the Parisian masters were divided into 4 faculties or powers: theology, canon law, medicine, and arts. In contrast with Bologna, civil law had, after 1219, no place in the University of Paris. The curriculum began with the 7 arts, advanced to philosophy, and culminated in theology. The arts students, who were called artisti, artists, corresponded to our undergraduates. As they constituted by far the greatest part of the academic population in Paris, they divided, probably for mutual aid, sociability, and discipline, into 4 nations, according to their place of birth, natio, or origin. France, that is, the narrow realm directly subject to the French king, Picardy, Normandy, and England. Students from southern France, Italy, and Spain were taken into the French nation, students from the Low Countries into Picardy, students from Central and Eastern Europe into England. So many students came from Germany that that country was delayed in establishing its own universities until 1347. Each nation was governed by a procurator, or proctor, each faculty by a decanus, or dean. The students, and perhaps also the masters, in the Faculty of Arts chose a rector as their head. Gradually his functions widened until by 1255 he had become the rector of the university. We hear of no special university buildings. Apparently in the 12th century the lectures were given in the cloisters of Notre Dame, Saint Geneviève, Saint Victor, or other ecclesiastic structures. But in the 13th century we find teachers hiring private rooms for their classes. The masters, who came to be called also professores, or proclaimers, were tonsured clerics who, before the 15th century, lost their position if they married. Teaching was by lectures, largely for the reason that not every student could afford to buy all the texts to be studied and could not always secure copies from the libraries. The students sat on pavement or floor and took many notes. The burden on their memories was so severe that many mnemonic devices were contrived, usually in the form of verses pregnant with meaning and repulsive in form. University regulations forbade the teacher to read his lecture. He was required to speak extempore, and was even forbidden to drawl. Students graciously warned newcomers not to pay for a course until they had attended 3 lectures. William of Conches, in the 12th century, complained that teachers gave easy courses to gain popularity, students, and fees, and that the elective system by which each student had a wide choice among teachers and subjects was lowering the standard of education. The teaching was occasionally enlivened by public disputations among the masters, advanced students, and distinguished visitors. Usually the discussion followed a set form, the scholastica disputatio. The question was stated, a negative answer was given, and was defended by scriptural and patristic quotations, and by reasoning in the form of objections. A positive answer followed, defended by quotations from the Bible and the Fathers of the Church, and by reasoned replies to the objections. This scholastica disputatio determined the finished form of scholastic philosophy in St. Thomas Aquinas. In addition to such formal questiones disputatae, there were informal discussions called quod libeta, whatever you please, where the disputants took up any question that might be propounded at the moment. These looser debates also created a literary form, as in the minor writings of St. Thomas. Such debates, formal or informal, sharpened the medieval mind and gave scope for much freedom of thought and speech. In some men, however, they tended to promote a cleverness that could prove anything, or a logorrhea that piled mountains of argument on trivial points. Most of the students lived in hospitia, or guest houses, hired by organized student groups. Sometimes a hospital would board poor students at a nominal fee, so the Hôtel Dieu, adjoining Notre Dame, set aside a room for poor clerks. In 1180, Josius of London bought this apartment, and thereafter shared with the hospital in providing lodging and meals for 18 students in it. By 1231, this group of students had taken larger quarters, but they still called themselves the Collège des 18, the College of 18. Other hospitia or resident halls were established by monastic orders, or churches, or philanthropists, with endowments, or bursae, or annuities that reduced the cost of living for the student. In 1257, Robert de Sorbonne, chaplain to St. Louis, endowed the House of Sorbonne for 16 theological students. Additional benefactions from Louis and others provided more accommodations and raised the number of scholarships to 36. Out of this house grew the College of the Sorbonne. Further colleges, or collegia in the old sense of associations, were founded after 1300. Masters came to live in them, served as tutors, heard recitations, and read texts with the students. In the 15th century, the masters gave courses in the residence halls. Such courses increased in number, courses given outside decreased, and the college became a hall of education as well as a student dwelling place. A similar evolution of the college out of the hospitium occurred at Oxford, Montpellier, and Toulouse. The university began as an association of teachers dealing with an association of students, and became an association of faculties and colleges. Among the residence halls at Paris were 2 designed for student members or novices of the Dominican or Franciscan order. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.